Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be tackling a topic that's, it's pretty universal. We're going to be talking about grief.
Yeah, grief, it's something that, well, we all experience at some point, right?
Exactly. And we're going to be taking a deep dive into this article called Navigating Grief, Its Impact on Individuals, Work, and Employers. And this article, it's really eye-opening. Like it really digs into all the ways that grief affects us, not just, emotionally, but also like at work and even like for employers themselves.
It really shines a light on how grief isn't just an individual thing. It kind of ripples outward, It touches our relationships, our work, everything.
Yeah, totally. Like one of the things that really jumped out at me from this article was that grief, it's not just about sadness, right? It's like a whole whirlwind of emotions. You've got anger in there and guilt, even confusion. Like it's way more complex than people might think.
Yeah. That's so true. And I think sometimes we kind of have this oversimplified view of grief, like we expect people to just be sad and then, move on. But the reality is so much messier and, well, it's just more complicated than that.
It really is. And that's why I think this deep dive is going to be so important for everyone listening. Because whether you've personally gone through a loss or you want to be there for someone who's grieving, or even if you just want to understand this whole human experience better, this is going to give you some really valuable insights.
Absolutely. And, the article starts by kind of breaking down the individual experience of grief. And like you were saying, it lists all sorts of ways grief can show up. Fatigue, difficulty concentrating, even physical stuff like headaches. It's not just about feeling down,
Right. It can manifest in all these different ways. And I think that's something a lot of people don't realize. They might think, oh, I'm not really grieving because I'm not crying all the time. But grief can be so much more subtle than that.
Exactly. And it's also, it's important to remember that grief is incredibly diverse. Like there's no one right way to grieve. The intensity, how long it lasts, it varies wildly from person to person. So if you're listening and thinking, well, my grief didn't look like that, that's totally okay. Your experience is valid, whatever it looks like.
That's such an important point. There's no one size fits all approach to grief. It's going to be different for everyone. Okay, so now, this is where things get even more interesting. The article says that grief can actually mess with your decision-making, which, I had never really thought about before, but it makes total sense.
Yeah, it's like when you're grieving, your brain is kind of overloaded, right? You're processing so many emotions. It can be hard to think clearly.
Totally. So imagine, you're at work and you're trying to make important choices or lead a team or even just focus on your daily tasks. Grief can totally throw a wrench in the works,
Oh, absolutely. And that leads us to kind of the bigger picture here, which is how personal grief, spills over into our professional lives. The article points out some of the common impacts like decreased productivity and people missing work more often and just, strained relationships with colleagues. And in some jobs, there's even the potential for safety concerns, which is, well, that's a whole other level.
Whoa, hold on. Safety concerns. That sounds pretty serious.
Yeah.
Like what kind of example? Can you give me an example of what that might look like?
Yeah. So imagine a surgeon who's, recently lost a child or a pilot who's grieving the death of a spouse. Their grief, it's so intense it could affect their focus, their decision-making in ways that could lead to some pretty dangerous situations. And that really highlights how important it is to, recognize and address grief, not just for the person's own well-being, but for the safety of others too.
That's kind of a chilling thought. But it really underscores just how crucial this whole issue is. So, what can employers actually do? Because the article, it seems to put a lot of emphasis on their role in, supporting employees who are grieving. It talks about stuff like having clear bereavement policies, open communication, and making resources available like grief counseling. What are your thoughts on all that?
I think those are all, fantastic starting points. But I think what's really, really crucial is empathetic leadership. Managers and supervisors who are actually trained to handle grief sensitively, they can make a huge difference. They can create a safe space for employees to talk about what they need, and provide genuine support without, making things worse.
Yeah, for sure. Because forcing someone back to work before they're ready or, just ignoring their struggles altogether, that's just going to backfire, right?
Absolutely. It's about preventing unintentional harm, There's this quote in the article that really stuck with me. It says, employers must balance compassion with business needs. And it really highlights that kind of tension,
Yeah.
that inherent tension in these situations. Like, how do you balance caring for employees with, keeping things running smoothly? It's a tough one. It is a tough one. It's a delicate balance. And navigating that tension, it requires, thoughtful policies and open communication and just a real commitment to understanding how grief impacts individuals and the workplace as a whole. And, to bring in a more personal perspective, the article actually introduces us to the director of family services at a funeral home. Talk about someone who sees grief up close every single day.
Wow. Yeah. That's a perspective I'd never really considered before. What
Yeah.
kind of insights does the director, what do they have to offer?
Well, this is where we get a glimpse into, the human side of grief. It's not just academic or theoretical. It's coming from someone who's, navigating the complexities of grief day in and day out. What really struck me is how the director talks about how grief has actually shaped their approach, their commitment to helping others. It's a powerful testament to grief's impact.
It's almost like grief has become part of their professional purpose,
Yeah.
although I'm sure it's got to be incredibly challenging work. They also discuss what it's like to work at a funeral home, right? Like, what's that like?
They do, and they really emphasize the importance of mental health support for employees, especially, for those who are dealing with grief regularly. It kind of brings in an organizational perspective on managing grief's impact, because even people who work with it professionally, they need care and support too.
That's so true. I think a lot of people don't realize that. Like, if you're constantly surrounded by death and, families in mourning, it's bound to take a toll on you, right? It really highlights the need for like built-in support systems in organizations, especially those dealing with, death and dying.
Exactly. It reminds us that grief doesn't just impact, individuals in isolation. It has this ripple effect outward, affecting families, workplaces, and even entire communities. And we need to recognize that interconnectedness if we want to, build a more compassionate and supportive world.
Yeah, it's like you were saying before, grief, it creates this ripple effect that goes way beyond just the individual. It's like, when you drop a pebble into a still pond, the ripples, they just keep expanding outward, touching everything in their path. It's powerful stuff. So what does all of this, what does it mean for us? How can we actually use these insights in our own lives and, in our workplaces?
That's the big question, right? I think the first step is, it's awareness. We need to recognize that grief is just a natural part of being human. It deserves our understanding, our support. It's not something to be, scared of or avoid or pretend isn't there.
Right, like brushing it under the rug or expecting people to just get over it. That's not helpful at all. In fact, it can be really harmful.
Mm-hmm.
We need to create space for grief, both personally and professionally.
I completely agree. And that means, fostering a culture of empathy and compassion. It's about really listening to people, validating their experiences, and offering support without judgment. Sometimes it's just about being there for someone who's hurting, even if you don't have all the answers.
For sure. The article, it mentions some concrete things that employers can do, like offering grief counseling or, flexible work arrangements. Those seem like positive steps, right? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think those are great resources to have in place. But it's important to remember that, policies are only as good as their implementation. Like, if people don't feel comfortable using them, or if managers aren't trained on how to handle grief sensitively, they're not going to be effective.
So it's not enough to just, have a policy written down somewhere. You have to actually create a culture where people, they feel supported in using it.
Yeah.
It's about, walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Exactly. It requires a shift in mindset, I think, for both individuals and organizations. We need to move away from seeing grief as a weakness or, a personal failing, and embrace it as just part of the human experience.
Yeah, it's almost like we need to redefine how we think about grief, instead of seeing it as something to conquer or overcome. It's something we learn to navigate, with the support and compassion.
I love that way of putting it. And it's a journey, right? It takes patience, understanding, and a willingness to learn and grow. Going back to the director's perspective for a minute, I think there's a lot we can glean from their experience. Working in a funeral home, it provides such a unique lens on grief.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear more about that. What insights do they share?
One of the things they talked about was, it was the importance of self-care and building resilience, especially for those who work with death and loss, on a regular basis.
Right, because they're seeing it all the time.
Yeah.
And they mentioned how witnessing that sorrow, the sorrow of others, it can really take an emotional toll, and how important it is to have like coping mechanisms and support systems in place.
Yeah, and it's a powerful reminder that even those who are, dedicated to helping others through grief, they need care and support themselves. It's not a sign of weakness, but of strength and self-awareness.
It makes you wonder, like, what kind of support systems are out there for people in those professions? Are there any specific, training programs or resources to help them navigate the emotional challenges they face?
That's a great question. And it highlights the need for, I think, more research and awareness around grief, particularly, in professional settings. We need to understand the unique challenges that those working with grieving individuals and families face and develop strategies to support their well-being.
And thinking back to those, those ripple effects we discussed earlier,
Yeah.
if those who are supporting grieving individuals, if they're not getting the support they need, that can have a negative impact on everyone involved, like a domino effect.
You're absolutely right. We need to approach grief from a holistic perspective, recognizing that its impact, it extends beyond just the individual. It's about creating a web of support that encompasses individuals, families, workplaces, and communities.
It's about recognizing that, that we're all in this together, and that supporting each other through grief, it's essential for building a more compassionate and resilient society.
Beautifully said. And it's a journey that requires, ongoing dialogue, education, and a willingness to challenge our assumptions about grief and loss.
So where do we go from here? How do we take these insights and, translate them into action?
That's a great question to ponder as we move into the final part of our deep dive. We've explored the individual experience of grief, its impact on the workplace, and the importance of empathetic leadership and support systems.
And we've heard a powerful perspective from someone who works with grief every day, reminding us of the human side of this complex experience. But there's still so much to explore.
Stay tuned as we delve into the practical implications of these insights and discuss how we can all play a role in creating a world that, that better understands and supports those navigating grief.
All right, so we've talked about a lot, right? What grief is, how it impacts us, the support systems that can, make a difference. But let's get practical for a second.
Mm-hmm.
What are some things we can, actually do to navigate grief, both individually and as a society? Like, how can we do this better?
That's the key question, right? Is where the rubber meets the road. And I think one of the most important things is education. Like, we need to educate ourselves about grief. There are so many resources out there, books, podcasts, workshops, all sorts of things that can help us, really understand how complex this experience is.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like anything else, right? The more you know about something, the better equipped you are to deal with it. Like, you wouldn't expect someone to fix a car engine without any knowledge or training, right?
Mm-hmm.
Grief's kind of the same way. We need to learn about it so we can approach it with, understanding and skill.
Exactly. And this education, it's not just for individuals. It's super important for organizations, too. Like, employers should be providing training for managers and supervisors on how to support grieving employees.
Oh, for sure. Like, give me an example. What would that training look like?
Well, it could include things like, recognizing the signs of grief, understanding how it can impact someone's work, and knowing how to communicate with empathy and sensitivity, not saying the wrong thing, making things worse.
Yeah, that seems essential, especially given everything we've been talking about empathetic leadership and all that. But let's not forget about self-care too, right? The article, it really emphasized how important self-care is, especially for people who, work with grieving individuals. It's easy to get so caught up in taking care of others that we forget about ourselves.
It's like, have you ever heard that analogy about the oxygen mask on an airplane?
Oh, yeah.
You have to put on your own mask first before you can help anyone else.
Right. Makes sense.
And self-care, it's not selfish. It's essential. It means we can show up for others in a healthy way, in a sustainable way,
Okay, so like, what are some examples of that?
It can be things like, setting boundaries, practicing mindfulness, making time for hobbies, or seeking professional support when you need it. It's about, replenishing your own well to be able to give to others.
I like that analogy. And, sometimes self-care can be as simple as just acknowledging that we don't have all the answers. Sometimes the best thing we can do is just listen listen with empathy, and be a shoulder to cry on. We don't always have to have a solution or try to fix things. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I totally agree. Being present with someone in their pain, without judgment, without trying to force a solution, that can be so powerful. It's just listening and validating their experience. It can mean the world.
And let's not forget about the power of community too, right?
Yeah.
Connecting with others who have also experienced loss, that can be incredibly validating. It creates a sense of, well, of belonging that can be, hard to find in other places.
Absolutely. Support groups, online forums, even just, casual gatherings with friends and family. These can all create a space to share stories, process emotions, and just, find strength in shared experience. It's like the old saying, shared joy is doubled, shared sorrow is halved.
I love that saying. Yeah. It reminds us that we don't have to, go through this alone. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's one key takeaway you want to leave our listeners with?
I think the most important thing to remember is that grief, it's not a linear process,
Mhm.
It's a journey with twists and turns, ups and downs. It's not something we get over. It's something we learn to live with. And as we navigate this journey, let's remember to be kind to ourselves and to others, Seek support when we need it and try to create a world where grief is met with understanding and compassion.
Couldn't have said it better myself. This deep dive has been, well, it's been really insightful.
Yeah.
And I hope everyone listening, they feel a little bit more equipped to navigate grief, both in their own lives and, in the lives of those around them.
You are not alone. And by embracing grief with awareness, empathy, and support, we can create a more compassionate and resilient world for everyone.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep diving deep.